Hello and welcome back to another video where we're going to talk about another lesson here in Faith and Reason Discipleship. 32 lessons to help us grow in our faith and knowledge of Jesus. So in lesson 2, it's about understanding the Great Commission. And really it is also teaching us what the process of discipleship is and why it's so significant and important that we be involved in that. And we begin by looking from Scripture at what discipleship is, and we see that Jesus, who has all authority, in his last words before he left, one of the things he said was, "Go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations," so that we're all to be involved in discipleship, making disciples. So that means I've got to begin to think in terms in my life that my calling as a Christian is not just to help other people get saved, but my calling is to help people get saved and then grow and become a disciple of Jesus to where their life is bearing fruit. And so we see that from the Great Commission. We also see that exemplified in the life of Jesus, in the ministry of Jesus. As just think of it, he came to this earth with just about 3.5 years of ministry to change the world forever. Now, obviously, he's going to do that by laying his life down on the cross, paying the price for our sin, and rising from the dead to provide for our salvation. But just think about it. If he'd have done that 2,000 years ago, but that message died out and nobody ever heard it, then his mission would not have been accomplished. So what he did in those 3.5 years is he put in place a strategy for changing the world forever. And it's the strategy of discipleship. And so if it's Jesus's strategy, we probably should pick up on that, don't you think? So Jesus did, and in your lesson here, there's this question about these terms, multitudes, 12, 3, and 1. And what it's guiding us to, this is the essence that you need to catch out of that. Jesus did teach and preach to and minister to the multitudes. So he did have ministry to large groups of people. But it's very clear from Scripture that he chose 12 to be his disciples, and they went with him everywhere he went. They watched him in ministry, and he taught them a number of the things that we read in Scripture in the Gospels were not spoken to multitudes. They were spoken to the 12 disciples. But now then, even beyond that, Jesus went further than that. Out of the 12 disciples, there's a number of passages where he takes Peter, James, and John aside, and he ministers things to them directly, just this 1-on-3 ministry, preparing them to be the leaders of the disciples after he goes back to heaven and to the start of the New Testament church. Well, then he takes it one step further. There's a number of encounters within the gospel where Jesus ministers to one specifically, and that's Peter, and has these one-on-one moments with him and interactions with him, preparing him to be the ultimate leader to start the New Testament church. Then it's Peter that stands up on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and the first sermon is preached by Peter, and I think it's 3,000 people get saved that day, and boy, they're off and running, and they begin to minister and change the world, and then Peter, James, and John are leading, and then the 12 disciples as a whole are leading the church in the New Testament. So the principle of discipleship, Jesus knew if this thing's going to grow, it's not just me throwing out a lot of seed to a lot of people, but I've got to specifically sow into the lives of some faithful men who will then share that with others. So that's the principle of discipleship. We do a number of things in this lesson as well, leading you through some passages in Acts that talks about they added to their numbers daily, but then there's another verse that talks about that the number of disciples or believers were multiplied. And we look at that whole principle of the difference between addition and multiplication. And think about that. Boy, multiplication becomes exponential. And that's where the power of it is, where addition never becomes exponential. And we see this principle in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And the four links that are listed there are Paul, Timothy, faithful men, and others. Paul says, take to Timothy. Paul is teaching Timothy. He says, take the things that you've learned from me and entrust them to faithful men. That's the third link. So Paul to Timothy, Timothy to faithful men who will then teach others. So we see this process of discipleship. And that needs to be a pattern in our life, that we're looking for faithful people who are hungry to grow and learn, who will not only then learn, but will then teach others. We also share the important ingredients of discipleship here: teaching, prayer, example, fellowship, and ministry. Remember that true discipleship, if you really want to be effective, has to be more than just having a class and studying a book. But it really becomes an experience where you're interacting, your lives are interacting, and there's a relationship there, and there's, you're praying that God allows you to be an example, not just a person teaching a lesson. And that, so that the people you're engaged with are not only learning information from you, but are watching your life and are absorbing from your example. And you don't have to be perfect to do that. You might say, oh my goodness, well, if that's what it's all about, I could never do that. Well, we're all called to do it. Jesus didn't want us to wait till we got perfect or became, a leader of thousands of people to be equipped to do this. It's just any believer who's on that journey and able then to take somebody else along that journey. I remember years ago when my son was learning to play the guitar, and I had played the guitar for decades at this point, but I wasn't very good at teaching other people. And I watched my son one day as his friend was interested in learning, and my son was just starting to learn. He couldn't hardly even play a full song yet, but he was on his knees as the guitar was in the hands of his friend who was sitting on the chair, and Tim was down on his knees helping him form the chords, teaching him how to play the guitar. And I watched and I marveled at that, thinking, here he is just learning, and he's got a long way to go to be a guitar player, but he's already mentoring, teaching somebody else. So you see, you don't have to know everything there is about Christianity to make disciples. You just, as you have a humble heart to grow and learn, then you just share that with others. And when you mess up, you tell them I messed up. When when you don't know, you just say I don't know. But when people can see your heart and you're on the journey, you're growing and learning, you can take other people along with you. And just a couple other thoughts just to explain this section toward the end of the lesson. What would you rather have, $1 million or a penny doubled every day for a 31-day month? You just need to do the math on that, get a calculator out. And it's really fun, and you'll find too this principle of exponential multiplication is powerful. And then it's shown in a second way, thinking of how long would it take to reach 8 billion people, winning 1,000. Can you imagine a person who could win 1,000 people a day to Jesus? But you figure the math out, how long it takes 1,000 a day to get to 8 billion. And then compare that to somebody finding one person, leading them to Christ, and discipling them for a year. And at the end of that year, those two people find a person each, lead them to Christ, and disciple them. At the end of that year, 4, then 8, then 16. And you find out, do the math, and find out how many years it would take to win the whole world to Jesus with that pattern. It will astound you. And it powerfully illustrates why Jesus chose this model and why we need to be involved in this model of making disciples. God bless.